Welcome to Dead Man Talking. Tonight's show, we welcome back a good friend TwoCanTheRapper from over on Reddit No Sleep, who you guys might remember from such stories as, do you know what a fatberg is? And I brought forth my Cockney natural accent, with a slight exaggeration for entertainment purposes. And thankfully Toucan was so pleased with my performance that he got to writing an East End London classic horror, in my opinion, that I think you guys are going to sink your teeth into. Of course, as ever, please do let us know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. Well, it really does help build the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag TeamFEAR and DMT's Cryptid crew. And so, with that aside, let's get into tonight's story. Entitled, I was a crime lord in 1970s London. Will you help me keep my secret? Let's get straight into that. I want to start by saying this. I wasn't a gangster. I don't like the word. Didn't then, still don't. I was a businessman. My business just happened to be crime. Here's the thing though, right? I've been a straight goer for 30 years now. The old Bill never managed to nick me, to catch me on the job and send me down. And I got out as soon as I had enough scratch to fly off to Ibiza and stay low. And that's where I'm writing this to you from. My sunny bungalow, while wife number 5 makes martinis and I enjoy a Mediterranean breeze I don't deserve. Now, she barely speaks a word of the Queen's. I'm not good at Spanish neither. Well, it's something I've wanted to get off my chest for a few years. Due to, well, the doctor advised me yesterday that I cancel any long-term plans. And if I don't share this now, I won't ever get a chance. And bless wife number 5, but she ain't the ear I need on this one. I need someone who understands my words. All my words. I'm still wanted back home, and I don't know who in the old crowd is still trustworthy these days, or even still breathing, so you lot will have to do. Now, I got up to a lot of things back in the day. More than one fella caught a slug in the chops to pay for the years of paradise I've enjoyed. Am I guilty? Nah, that's not what this is about. I never done someone that weren't holding a shooter or a blade themselves. And this ain't a remorseful confession because I don't have any. It was what it was, which was business. But this ain't about what I did, but what I saw, and how I learned I never come close to depravity of what real evil is. A single night, halfway through my stint as Bethnal Green's Billy Big Bollocks. The only night I wasn't the most dangerous thing in the room. Now the year was 1976. I don't remember what month, but I know it was winter because I was freezing my tits off. I had 3 of the lads with me. Big Steve, Nicky, the Shimmy Shaker, and Screwloose. Now Big Steve's name was ironic. He was a little fella, barely over 5 feet, but he had a mean kick and wasn't afraid to kneecap anyone dumb enough to cross him. And gangling, awkward Nicky was known as the Shimmy Shaker because the way he'd bump and fumble into oblivious tourists and walk away with their wallet, jewellery, etc. A young Nicky, he was good in a scrap, and of all of the firm, he was the one whose loyalty I never questioned. As for Screwloose, well, you only get a name like Screwloose one way, and that's why he only came out on jobs like this one. The big jobs, the ones where you know it's going to get bloody. Only 4 of us knew the job was a job, or so we thought. Turned out the 6 fellas from the Turkish gang setting up on my turf had done a job of their own. It was supposed to be a meet, a negotiation. I'm a sly bastard and I intended to negotiate by way of Screwloose sawn-off shotgun named Elvis. And the Turkish fellas, they were also sly bastards, and they had the same idea. So yeah, we'd gone down to that warehouse to ambush a bunch of mugs who were there to ambush us themselves. Both sides have agreed to the warehouse because it was kind of the place you could have meetings like this. Quiet, remote, far away from prying eyes and listening ears. Slap bang in the middle of an abandoned industrial estate, easily a few miles across. Perfect for business with a criminal variety. and chosen by me because I knew it was too isolated for gunshots to be overheard. Accepted by the Turks for, I now realise, exactly the same reason. Nah, seems quite dramatic, don't it? Thing is, in my line of work, that should have been any other night. That was a standard blooming Tuesday for me. Why else do you think I kept a guy named Screwloose on the firm? In the back of your mind, you're always prepared for a job to go south. And we learned as soon as we opened the warehouse door that our idea of south was nowhere near southern enough. What we found wasn't a job that had just gone bloody south. It had gone Scott's lost bloody expedition Antarctic south. Remember how I said Big Steve was my go-to guy for shattering kneecaps? Yeah, bastard wasn't exactly squeamish. The aftermath of what must have gone down just before we'd arrived had him chucking up pie and mash everywhere. Young Nicky started sobbing. It wasn't a good look, that. Kind of thing that would get him a slap on any other night. Thing is, given what we were staring at, I understood. If I wasn't pushing 40 at the time and hardened to the world around me, I probably had done the same. Even Screwloose muttered, "Jesus bleeding Christ," under his breath. We'd been expecting 6 Turkish fellas. We expected them to be breathing. We found 2, and they weren't. "Bloody hell, Archie. What do you think happened here?" Big Steve said after he'd pulled himself up from painting the floor. "This weren't no argy-bargy, Arch. This weren't no ruck." "Don't you think I can see that, Steve, mate? Of course this weren't no bloody fight. Look at the bloke at the bloody table. He's missing the back of his bonds. What do you think could have done that?" I raised an eyebrow at Big Steve. He was pale, and though he did his best to hide it, I could see the tremble in his fingers. "A shooter, Arch. A big one." This time, it was Screwloose speaking. His knuckles were tight around the outline of Elvis, his own big shooter, tucked inside his trench coat. "Right you are, Screwloose. Exactly. Only thing what could have done him like that is a shooter, a bloody big shooter." "And what about the other fella, Archie?" Well, this was Nicky the Shimmy Shaker, quiet and sniffling. "The other? Will bugger me sideways, Nicky. I have no bloody idea. I do know this whole mess leaves a bloody big question, though." "What's that, Arch?" Screw said once more. No tremble here, just that usual cold edge. "Simple, Screwloose, me old chum. The question this raises is, who the fuck has balls so big that they think they can get away with this Jack the Ripper shit on my bloody turf?" The anger in my raised voice bounced off the warehouse walls. Was I actually angry? Of course I was. Showing it was a choice, though. I wasn't only angry. Anger wasn't even most of what it was. I had to inflate my own rage to put on a face-saving bravado I needed. I couldn't let these lads see what else I felt. The emotion that outweighed my ire tenfold. And for the first time since I was a nipper on my first job, I was afraid. I don't care how tough or big you are. I'm as hard as they come, mate. Didn't matter. Nobody could have walked into that carnage without feeling their gut drop through a trap door. Home, sweet home. The words were daubed on the wall behind Mr. Blown-Out's bonds. Each letter was as tall as Big Steve, easily. It was obvious what they were being painted with. I'll give you a clue. It's dark red and blooming difficult to clean out of a carpet. I ain't talking about wine or tomato sauce, neither. Now the poor bloke with exposed brain matter was slumped forward on a table. There was an empty chair opposite him, set up for the meet that really never happened. If I had lifted his head, it'd have been Erdem Akbas, my counterpart in the Turkish farm. Well, what was left of his face would have been Erdem Akbas. The suit was too nice for an almost headless corpse to belong to anyone else. So was the chrome-plated pistol he'd been midway through drawing when he gained a new orifice. His grip was still tight around the handle, the flashy shooter hanging halfway out of the holster. But it weren't him that turned my stomach, though. The other bloke did that. The one whose blood was used to paint the crudely spelled message on the decaying brickwork. We knew the blood hadn't come from Erdem. Erdem's was pooling all over the table, dripping a little over one edge, but hadn't travelled far from his head wound. The blood used as ink could only have come from the poor bastard scattered about in a 12 pieces. If I didn't know any better, I'd say he'd been blown up. A few summers prior, we'd moved some hand grenades for a less than patriotic business associate in Northern Ireland. I had a guy in my crew we used to call Anzi Eddie. I didn't, after the grenade job. I'll let your imagination do the rest, yeah? Now the unnamed Turkish footman, aka Goon number 1, in the warehouse, hadn't been anywhere near an explosion. We'd had to scrape Anzi Eddie's remains off the walls after the accident. And aside from the crimson writing, the walls of the warehouse were, well, they were clean. But there was nothing on them besides London soot and grime. Plus, the bits of Anzi Eddie we buried were ragged and burned. Well, there were no scorch marks on any of the chunks of flesh strewn about the meeting place. No fabric melted to the skin. The cheap suit of the poor bastard had been wearing was in tatters, spread everywhere like polyester confetti. The pieces of the Turkish footman were ragged neither. He had been taken apart evenly, been segmented, split. The precision where torso had been torn from limbs was almost surgical. I wasn't a stranger to what a man's insides looked like. I'd even seen my own more than once before I learned never to take your eye off a man with a shiv. I'd never seen anything like this. None of us had, not even Screwloose. The fire here, the calf somewhere way over there. Fingers flung about the place, guts and gizzards splayed out in a heap. The only part that hadn't been discarded was the poor bastard's head. Whoever had done this had driven the biggest iron spike I'd ever bloody seen through a Turkish footman's face. The sick bastard had nailed the severed head to the wall, hanging it like a pride of place hunting trophy above the message. In my time I've done a lot of bad things any straight guy would recoil at. I don't lose no sleep over it. I was a criminal, but that didn't mean I was unethical. I wasn't a gangster. I was a businessman. I had rules. 3 things that never got moved on my turf: gear, nonce material, and people. Other than that, anything was fair game for me, especially violence, extortion, torture, murder, etc. However, no matter how much I wanted them dead, my vendetta against the Turks was business. No part of me thought of any of them deserving anything close to what they'd been given. I don't know how long we stood in that warehouse doorway before Screwloose walked in to get a closer look. Crazy bastard didn't bother to step around the eviscerated remains. Just ploughed straight through till he was underneath the crudely written message. "This is a bloody mess, Arch," he eventually said. "Excuse me French, but fucking hell. This weren't a job, mate. This was a bleeding animal who done this." I followed Screwloose to gaze up at the mounted head. It was harder to mask my worry this close, especially with Screwloose visibly shaking. Big Steve was my go-to chap for cracking kneecaps. I called Screwloose when kneecaps weren't enough. He was a few years older than I was, old enough to have held a rifle during the last few years of the war. He'd done and seen some things out there in France, things that made the taking a power drill to a man's Achilles tendon or closing a vice around their family jewels no big ask. And when we heard the scream from deeper in the warehouse, I was almost glad for the distraction. Almost. "Well, what in the hell's that?" Nicky's hand was tightening around the crowbar tucked into his trouser leg. Big Steve already had a switchblade in one hand and his token hammer in the other. "I reckon that's where we'll find a sick bastard who done this." My own fingers were already finding a snub-nosed 44 holstered in my right hip. "Steve's right, Nicky. Whoever done this can't have got far." "Blood's not even dried yet," Screwloose muttered, scratching one of the glistening letters with a dirty fingernail. "Right, exactly." I nodded again, the break in the tension making it easier to rally both myself and the boys. "Some prick thinks he can play Yorkshire Ripper in my backyard. We ain't bloody having it, lads. All right, never mind the Turks. Let's find this rat before it flees the nest. We need to send a message." "What message is that, Arch?" "The message is simple, Nicky. The only person who gets to decide who dies on Archie Stenworth's bloody patch is Archie bloody Stenworth." There's something about yelling your own name that fills you with confidence. When your name has clout, at least. It reminded myself that I was Archie bloody Stenworth, the people's governor of Bethnal Green. Well, it shook me out of my dread. Gave me that fire back, you know? Whoever done this was a sick, twisted pervert, I reasoned. But that's all. Even if this one had a knife or a shooter, even if he managed to get the drop on Erdem Akbas and his boys, he was still just one more sick bastard hiding in the grass on my turf, and we knew how to deal with them. Whether they got their kicks from kids, corpses, animals, or whatever this was, the solution was always the same, and it always worked. This was the rationale that gave me the strength to lead the boys into the shadowy depths between the rows of shelving. Even Nicky the shimmy shaker managed to pull himself together at the sight of me charging in the direction of the screaming, with shooter in hand and fury in my eyes. My bravado wasn't false now. You didn't get far in my line of work without learning to snuff your fear. I was Archie bloody Stenworth, and I was ready to go and do what Archie bloody Stenworth did. So yeah, my fearlessness, I was genuine for all of about 3 minutes. Maintaining it became an effort again the moment we found the hole. It was in the furthest corner of the warehouse, hidden where the shadows cast by flickering strip bolts curled and ebbed at their thickest. The gaping cavity in the solid concrete, twice as wide as a tube tunnel and descending at a sharp angle into a much purer darkness than the cloying kind within which we stood. "You reckon that's where we'll find them?" Screwloose said, once more fingering Elvis through his thick leather coat. Yeah, I agreed, fighting the urge to gulp. "I reckon you're right, Screwloose. What gave it away, mate? Was it the dead bastard over there? That one up there, or the fucking screaming?" And I paused. Excuse my French, lads. Sorry. I don't want to teach you how to suck X. You know the screams were coming from the hole. Of course they bloody were. I'm not going to insult you by pointing that out like some big surprise. If we found that hole and the screaming weren't coming from it, I'd have been a bit flummoxed. And finding the hole was a shock though. Nothing I knew could drill a hole that big and precise through concrete. Especially not in the past few days that we was last at this warehouse. And when a scream filled a void in the floor, definitely wasn't a bleeding fixture. Hole-induced shock alone wasn't what knocked the wind. I'd only just found them myself. It was finding Turkish goons number 2 and number 3 along with it that gave me a tight chest and breathing I had to consciously keep steady. These new poor dead bastards were dressed in the same cheap polyester. Goon number 2 was hanging over the lip at the other side of the hole, and was mostly intact. Apart from the gaping chasm in his chest, none of him was missing that I could see. That statement became less true with every second that passed though, as chunks of his exposed entrails would lose the will to remain attached, falling and landing with a wet thud somewhere in the depths. Aside from being on his belly, the wound was identical to what remained of Erdem Akbas's head. The kind of frayed, torn, ragged evisceration left over when you find yourself on the receiving end of 2 chambers of buckshot. Thing is though, a belly is a lot bigger than a head. Now the 2 halves of Turkish goon number 3 were held together by exposed spinal cord and half a dozen brave strands of sinew and other ligature. A sawn-off cantate a decent chunk of a man. But I've never seen one that could near tear someone in half, even point blank. There was no blood spray where the poor bastard lay either. Either he'd been shot by the biggest bloody shooter in Bethnal Green and then moved, or he was never shot at all. And goon number 2 was a lucky one. Goon number 3? Well, Jesus bloody Christ. I can't even think about the state of him without a stiff drink in me hand. Somehow, the poor mug was still alive. I say somehow because up until that night I'd assumed having most of your skin removed was fatal. The skinless man was coughing and spitting up blood from his perch on a girder some 45 feet above the hole. Crude rods had been jammed through his back to fix him sitting upright. Their gnarled ends emerged at either shoulder blade and looked like rusted wings. His flayed hide was spread behind him like a cape hanging from protruding rebars, and lidless eyes darted between us, exposed ribs rising and falling as he breathed. I think we were all glad for the screams coming from the owl. They meant we couldn't hear his gargling chokes as he tried to lean down and extend a skinless hand to attempt to beg us for help. His jaw flapping open and closed, teeth without lips locked forever in an impossibly wide grin that juxtaposed the terrified madness in his gaze. "Shall we get him down, Arch?" Big Steve was yelling, both to be heard over the screams and because, well, bloody hell. You read what I just wrote, yeah? Bugger that! The brick was flying through the air before I realised Screwloose had picked it up and lobbed it. We'd moved hand grenades in the past, but Screwloose was the only bloke on the firm who actually used one. Apart from Handsy Eddie, of course. His throwing arm hadn't lost its aim or power since he'd been a young lad trudging through the gutted remains of Nazi-occupied France. The snap of goon number 3's neck could be heard, even over the wails from the hole. The grey, grime-coated chunk of loose architecture connected squarely with a bony chin, sending a rain of shattered cartilage and loose marrow below us. The force carried the projectile, though, taking most of the exposed face with it, and leaving the head lolling in between rod-pierced shoulder blades on a broken, twitching spine. The flayed man hung still and limp, his only motion a slight sway on the stick spikes shoved both through him and somehow the solid steel girder he sat on. "What we do now, Arch? We're going to get the rest of the lads?" I could almost feel Nicky's disappointment when I shook my head. "Nah, we sort this out now. The vermin what done this doesn't leave this warehouse. You got it?" The boys nodded, Screwloose with enthusiasm, Big Steve gravely, and Nicky, the shimmy shaker, like he'd love to do literally anything else. I think it had been any other mug asking him to stay, he'd have told him to jog on. And so would Steve and Screwloose. I'm not any mug though, am I? I'm Archie bloody Stemworth, and of course they followed me down into that bloody hole. Did I want to go down there? Of course I bloody didn't. Thing is, you can't be Billy Big Bollocks or Bethnal Green if any bastard gets ideas in their head about your bollocks not being that big, after all. The thought of going into that hole, towards them screams, it made me bowels twist into balloon animals. The thought of showing weakness twisted them worse. There wouldn't be much weight to the name Archie Stemworth if word got around that Archie Stemworth was scared of going down that hole because he saw a little blood, as the rumour mill will report. Jesus, if only I'd known. Now this was the 70s, remember? No mobiles. We didn't even have a torch with us. Didn't think we'd need one, you see? Now the 70s it meant something else too. All four of us smoked. We all had Zippo lighters in our back pockets, so we at least had some light as we ventured deeper. Not enough to provide any comfort, mind. But a sliver of illumination that we could muster was scarce, flickering, and prone to snuffing out. Not what you want when your only guide is a disembodied screams echoing around you. At the angle of the decline made the first few minutes of descent, and before long, through the tunnel, it levelled out, meaning we could walk instead of half sliding on our backsides. At no point did the screaming we followed falter. It always sounded just around the next corner, forever a fraction of an inch beyond, where the darkness swallowed our feeble orange flamelight. With every yard we slid or stepped, I felt a little less like Archie bloody Stemworth. By the time we reached the point where the tunnel widened into a larger cavern, I was barely Archie at all. In my mind, I was little Archibald again, afraid and jumping at every creak and chitter in the shadows as I ran from the kitchen door to the outhouse at the back of my mum's garden on a cold winter's night. I was still managing to hide it from the lads though, but the illusion, it was paper thin. We were easily a mile underground. concrete had given way to rubble and drain pipes until they too vanished. The space we were in bore no signs of civilization, no signs of London where we had left behind. I was Archie bloody Stenworth, the Billy Big Bollocks of Bethnal Green. This far beneath my brick and mortar kingdom, my bollocks, they felt smaller than they ever had. Jesus bloody Christ, Arch, look at this place. We must be the first people who've come down here since about an hour ago. Screwloose cut Big Steve off mid-sentence, pointing at the corpse in the ground. We found goon number 4. Now, he was in a heap a little ways into the cavern. He wasn't laying in a heap, mind. For him to be laying down, he'd have to have been in one piece. Goon number 4, much like the far too young goon number 1 back in the warehouse, was in many. How the bloody hell did he cut him up so fast? Don't think about it, yeah? It won't matter how he'd done it by the morning because this bastard'll be dead. You hear me, Steve, mate? Dead. Doesn't matter how good a butcher the sick twat what done this would make, yeah? He picked the wrong bloody borough to try this shit on. But Arch, mate, this is bloody madness. I know we ain't exactly soft, but enough. I rounded on Big Steve, mustering whatever was left of Archie bloody Stenworth to bully my go-to kneecapper into a fearlessness I myself could no longer show. Big Steve gulped, nodding. He weren't going to run, but I knew he was only staying for the same reason that I'd led us down there in the first place. To save face. I turned, holding up my Zippo in a futile attempt to pierce more of the shadows. And that was when Screwloose said 3 words that twisted every nerve into a tighter knot than I'd ever thought possible. Arch, where's Nicky? What? I looked behind me at the lads. There was Big Steve, staring at the floor as he recomposed himself. There was Screwloose, Elvis gripped in his hand that wasn't holding his own lighter. Nicky the shimmy shaker? Why, he was nowhere. Nicky! Me yells bounced off unseen cavern walls. Nicky, bloody hell, Nicky, where are you? I had to ignore the smirk Screwloose didn't quite manage to hide. There was a waver in my voice, small but noticeable enough. This must have been the point that I'd forgotten all about being Archie bloody Stenworth, because I didn't care. What I wanted to do was find Nicky and get out. Sod being Billy Big Bollocks, I thought. Goon number 4 wasn't the source of the screams, and they were still going on, still toying with us, by being always just out of reach. Except in the wide cavern, outside the narrow and winding tunnels, they felt to be coming from everywhere. Like the flames to our lighters had made a bubble that outside of which was nothing save shadows and screams. A bubble that could pop at any moment. And before I knew what was happening, I was on my knees. This was the 70s. I didn't know what panic attacks were. Barely anyone did back then. And mental health ain't taboo these days though. And I've read enough about them to know that a panic attack is exactly what I was having. Me, Archie bloody Stenworth. That's not a good look, that. Arch, Governor? Screwloose was standing above me. I remember the glee twinkling in his eyes. It was clear even though the blur at the edges of my vision. I couldn't focus on it though. My brain was overloaded by sensation, by my heart slamming into my ribs, by my breaths coming too fast and shallow to deliver the air I needed, by the pressure at my temples and the ringing in my ears along with it. I couldn't distinguish where the sounds of the screaming ended and the sight of the shadows began. Everything from the frigid air on my face to the wrenching guilt at losing Nicky merged into one massive, overpowering, all-consuming dread. And to my surprise, it was Big Steve who brought me back. Snap out of it, Arch. We need to find Nicky. I'd never been so happy to feel the sting of his slap on my cheek. When my breathing was slow and I was aware again, I was looking up at Big Steve. He was holding out the same hand he caught me across the chops with, his expression terrified but understanding. I tell you what, if Big Steve had made it out of that cave, I'd have got a promotion. He'd pulled me to my feet so I could dust myself off. I'm sorry, lads, Don't know what came over me. I coughed. Nicky was with us when we came out the tunnel, weren't he? Yeah, he was, Big Steve replied. Right behind me and Screwloose. Could still hear him trying not to cry over the... What? Even Screwloose jumped when a heavy object landed between the three of us. The wet slam of it connected with the churned earth was so loud, we all fell backwards, pushed by some shockwave of the impact. As a reflex, my eyes closed. That meant I couldn't see the warm liquid that carried on the pressurised air, the wetness that splattered across my face. I didn't have to. Enough drops found me open mouth. I knew that metallic tang immediately. It was Big Steve that opened his eyes first. Jesus bloody Christ, Nicky! My own eyes snapped open. In less than a heartbeat, I was back on my feet, yelling at the folded heap of snapped limbs and twisted joints laying at them. Again, I didn't come here to insult your intelligence. You know I recognise that face, even though the jaw had been carved in, the nostrils wrenched open and the eyelids sliced off. It was obvious to anyone with half a brain cell in their noggin, whose mangled corpse was staring back up at me, dead-eyed and mid-scream. All I could think about was how I would break the news to his poor mum. Nicky, what the bloody actual hell? Screwloose didn't sound afraid. He sounded furious, which, for a man like Screwloose, was probably the same thing. He lifted his lighter as high as he could. Big Steve and I followed suit, all three of us straining to see just how in the actual Christ Nicky had managed to fall from the stalactites hidden so far above. And that's when we saw it for the first time. Thanks to Elvis, we only caught a glimpse. Unfortunately, the moment we spotted it, Screwloose squeezed his trigger finger. The half a second we had was enough to make out a pair of vast, circular surfaces peering down from the shadows. Orbs that barely reflected a lighter light, only catching enough of the flicker for them to let us know that we were being toyed with. Bloody hell, Screwloose, how you going to hit it from that far with bloody buckshot? He didn't answer. He was already sprinting into the dark in a direction the eyes had vanished. Don't ask me why, but Big Steve and I followed. And I regret that Big Steve never made it out. And poor young Nicky, of course. I never could find it in myself to give a monkeys about Screwloose, though. We'd been running after him for about 5 minutes when the light from his Zippo, it vanished. Big Steve and I stood still, our own bubble of light now pathetically small. Arch? What? You noticed that? What? Screwloose fucking vanishing? Yeah, that too, but... Arch? The screaming stopped. And I blinked, then paid better attention to my ears. And sure enough, the always distant screaming we'd been following had ceased. There was no sound save for the thumping of blood rushing through my eardrums with every heartbeat. Except, after a few moments, I realised that wasn't all I could hear. There was another sound, deep and low and faint. A sound coming from above, like something large, wet and organic being dragged down a rough cavern wall. I turned to ask Steve if he heard it too, but the words had caught in my throat while he was white. Not a single ounce of pigmentation remained on his clammy, tear-streaked face. That's not what left me speechless, though. What left me speechless was his trembling, extended finger. He was pointing at something behind me. Every shred of sense I possess protested as I turned. It was the slowest quarter second I've ever experienced. And by the end of it, I was openly screaming for the first time since me old dad chased me around the house with a belt. There, dangling upside down a few short inches from the tip of my nose, was Screwloose. There was no blood in his usually ruddy face. I expect that's because he was all leaking from the stumps where his arms used to be. His eyes rolled back in his skull for a few seconds before locking onto mine. Not fair. Was my turn. He managed to cough out the words. I'll never forget the anger in his eyes. The fury that he'd never got his chance to be top dog. His rage lasted right up until he went cross-eyed. I let out a nervous laugh at first. His grimace turned into a drooling, childish smile that I found contagious In my panic, I couldn't stop myself from letting out a nervous chuckle. "Screwloose, are you okay, mate?" I was in shock. My mind couldn't take it. It had forced the screaming voice behind my eyes, which understood what was happening, into silence. That's why I was so bemused when the tip of the blade pushed itself through Screwloose's forehead. But its emergence was slow, wet, and accompanied by a harrowing slurping suckling sound. It forced its way through skull and brain matter, entering the back of Screwloose's head, not stopping until blood-soaked steel protruded from the other side. And the blade was wide too, a machete-sized thing. By the time it had pushed through everything from brow to crown, it was split perfectly down the middle. I don't know if Screwloose actually hung there for a few minutes or if it just felt that way. I do know that when the blade rose without warning, my bemusement was officially over. I was screaming once more, unashamedly and without restraint. No need to mask it now, because so was Big Steve. As for Screwloose, it'd be hard for him to spread the scent now he'd been split in two. The vast rusty cleaver swam through his throat, chest, stomach with a single motion. It cleaved the dangling man in half, sliding up his form and slicing without resistance. And that's when I realised what had been holding Screwloose aloft. My knees grew weak as I gazed and followed the path of the blade to Screwloose's ankles. My cries were coming through as a word now. No. Over and over and over again, the word no, as loud as I could muster. My eyes could see it, but no part of me wanted to believe it. Around Screwloose's ankles were a pair of hands, the biggest I've ever seen. Thin fingers as long as broom handles curled around his legs, wrinkled leather palms the size of dinner plates crushing one calf each time. Then, from behind the two pussies of Screwloose, the third arm rose, the one holding a rusted machete, both as long as a man and sharp as a razor wire. I had just enough time to notice a sticky, peeling noise. Unfortunately, I didn't have enough to realise what it meant. And before I could will myself into doing anything other than yelling no, the arms holding the halves of Screwloose pulled apart. We were still screaming when the butchered segments were thrown into opposite ends of the darkness, tossed outside our light bubble with such force that our cries didn't mask the loud snaps and slaps and cracks of bone. I didn't look behind me to see where they'd landed. I couldn't look anywhere except straight up. Neither could Big Steve. I couldn't even form a no anymore. All I could do was create noise, project untainted terror, and hope my legs would take me and carry me back to safer, saner pastures.
"Sorry about the mess. I wasn't expecting visitors."
It wasn't me or Big Steve that spoke. The raspy, monotonous, childlike words came from a waking nightmare lowering itself into the flamelight. The thing was hanging from the stalactites by threads of glistening mucus as thick as a telephone pole. The fat, bulbous body was the length and depth of a double-decker bus. The closest thing that I can compare it to, why, it's a maggot. Or the swollen egg-spewing abdomen of an externally pregnant queen ant. At the other end of the behemoth larval form, directly above us, were 8 arms. Each was twice as long as I was tall, but thin as to appear brittle. If they hadn't just demonstrated their monstrous strength, that is. The trio of limbs that finished Screwloose were part of a cluster of 4 sprouting from a pulsing tumour-like growth. The thing had one of these bulges protruding from behind each of its ears, the talon-fingered arms framing its vast head like mandibles made of avian legs by an insane taxidermist. The fourth arm on that side held a huge burlap sack, dark, fly-covered and dripping black ichor. On its opposite flank, it held nothing save for a man in a cheap polyester suit. Not that it mattered anymore, but we'd found goon number 5. Goon number 5. bugger me. Goon number 5's low-priced suit was more or less intact. Only the back of his jacket and orange shirt had been torn open. So had his spinal cord. Once more the thing had opted for a clinical cut instead of ragged buckshot mimicking wounds. Goon number 5's back had been sliced vertically, skin and muscles peeled back to reveal a column of vertebrae. The interlocking bones of his spine had been cracked open like yellowed ivory clams. Goon number 5's web-like cranial nerves were exposed to the open air, dry and twitching, with the spinal fluid they needed completely drained. This unnatural cavity ran from Goon number 5's lower lumbar all the way up to the base of his skull. A portion of this too had been cracked open. The swollen welt of undulating brain tissue bulged from between perfectly sawn fragments of cranium. Goon number 5 twitched, moaned in the thing's arms, suspended by talon-like digits grasping his head, neck and groin. The fourth hand, it was running an index finger up and down the perimeter of the wound. It moved gracefully, like a dying man stroking their beloved's cheek for the final time.
I didn't want visitors. You are a bad landlord, Mr. Stenworth.
And hearing my name crushed my lungs and kick-started a wave of diaphragmatic spasms. My gaze moved from the groaning Turkish footman to the face of the centre of the arms. Well, it was human in shape, but no bloody human had a head the size of a van. And I wish that's where the details I have to share ended. A van-sized human head would have been bad enough, right? I should be so lucky. This thing, the thing that had massacred some of the hardest men in London, had the face of a baby. A colossal, slime-coated baby. His pudgy cheeks and brief joint button nose were pale, translucent, and beset by a network of varicose veins. The fat lips were caked in all shades of red, both bright wet crimsons and dark crusted purples. A trail of drool dangled from one corner of his toothless maw. Worst of all was his wide, sewer plate eyes. They were perfect circles, exactly like the eyes in a cartoon or kid's drawing. The angle of their surface, it was wrong. They were flat, almost concave, closer to those of a fish or a reptile. Their colouring was human, but only just about. Unblemished whites, thin grey irises, pupils the shade of bottled interstellar voids. A dead, glassy gaze that bore through me like I was so much earth and concrete. Bottomless pupils didn't move as the distended hands, the discarded screw loose like unwanted banana peel, grabbed Big Steve. Arch, help! I didn't help. I couldn't. Instead of raising my shooter, I listened to it clattering on the ground. My legs were numb, my mind filled with white noise. I couldn't even run to save my own neck, no matter how much what small consciousness remained wanted to. The thing pulled Big Steve towards its gaping maw, and neither of us could resist. I was Archie bloody Stenworth, and in that moment I realised just how much of a joke that was when compared to the true power in this world. Big Steve never managed to get another word in. The thing stuffed his head first between his fat lips. Dull crunches were accompanied by a fresh deluge of scarlet. Steve's legs kicked and bucked for a few seconds before falling still. The thing chewed for another agonising minute before it plucked Steve's lower half from his mouth. Slavering gums sucking the last of the meat from his exposed spine. It placed the legs into the dripping sack, licking its crust-coated lips, gaze still never leaving my own.
Please don't be a bad landlord again. You interrupted my music.
And I could feel its cold breath on the back of my neck as I ran. My feet found themselves again. Some things are just too much, you know? Once you get to a certain point, that primal instinct kicks in and you just go. And for me, That moment was seeing the purpose of Goon number 5's injury. The thing lowered the Turk towards me, making sure I got a good view of the stringy cranial nerves in his cracked spine.
Music.
The thing's 3 hands were moving before my brain had connected the dots. By the time it had, I was already rushing through the darkness, away from the insanity playing out in the flamelight. Goon number 5's bestial hair started the moment a talon tip touched an exposed nerve. And that's what tipped me past the point of doing anything but running. The music the thing was talking about, it was the screaming we had followed. That's the sight that broke the proverbial camel's back. Those avian digits plucking at the open nerves of Goon number 5's spine, purposefully stimulating pain receptors and playing him like a fucking instrument. I don't know how my legs found the tunnel, or my arms the perches to climb. I weren't aware again until I was sat in the Mini Cooper, sobbing uncontrollably into the steering wheel. I didn't look back as I sped off fast as I bloody could. I couldn't even if I wanted to. I knew I couldn't handle seeing those glassy, silver plate eyes watching me from the gloom behind the broken windows. I never went back to that warehouse. I had the boys fence it off, make it appear condemned. A fair few junkies and homeless types wandered in over the years, but none of them ever wandered out again. As far as the firm was concerned, I was the only survivor of a meat gone south. I only managed another 15 or so years before retiring. My heart wasn't in it no more, you see. Not after finding out the horrors waiting below the streets I lorded over. And soon enough, my heart won't be anything no more. Kind of funny when you think about it. After all the things I've done and seen, in the end, it'd be a bum ticker what gets me. Well, thanks for listening to my story. Feels good getting it off my chest. I only ask one thing of you. The kind of people that know me aren't the kind of people that stand still long enough to read something this long. If by any chance you hear my name mentioned in conversation, you tell them something. You tell them Archie Stemworth, or that man weren't afraid of nothing. And that's all I'm asking. I want you to keep up the lie, the myth, the legend. I'm trying to compromise, you see. I don't want to die with secrets, and so I'm spilling them to folk I know I can trust to keep them. I'm Archie bloody Stemworth, and for one night, I was more afraid of something than any other man before or since. But let's just keep that between us though, eh? Wow. Wow. Not enough wows for this one, but I'll have another one. Wow. 4 months overdue, but well and truly worth the wait. You see how I bring back the tease now? I hope you guys enjoyed that one as much as I, and of course, a good friend the writer, TwoCanTheRapper, a fellow Brit, and I suspect a fellow East Ender. Absolutely incredible story this Toucan. Can't thank you enough for writing it with me in mind, and I hope I nailed every character with a little twist and a little bit of their own personality. Of course, a huge thank you for your patience in waiting for me to get this on the channel. Really do appreciate your input and your support. And of course, I hope you enjoyed this performance. Well, guys and girls, as ever, you know the drill. Please do let me know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. Why, it really does help build the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag TeamFEAR and DMT's Cryptid Crew. I said it before and I say it again. If you think you got the minerals to write the next big hit, then please do get in touch with me at the contact email, which is, as on screen, contactthedeadone@gmail.com. I really look forward to hearing from you. As ever guys, a huge thank you for your patience over these testing times. Really do appreciate all the likes, comments and shares, and I certainly hope you'll bear with me as I get a few things in order. As ever, Much love and respect. But above all, remember, be safe, not sorry.